Hello and welcome to Coffee Talk with Serge, the interview series. Take a load off from your busy workday and listen to the dulcet tunes of our guests, who are all over the cybersecurity landscape. We're going to ask them some hard questions, not going to lie, probably some softballs too. But no matter what, it's going to be a good time. So sit back, pour yourself a nice hot cup of coffee, or something stronger if it's that time of day, and enjoy Coffee Talk with Serge. I'm so creative.
I can't believe you made an intro just for Serge. I
Just
really appreciate it.
We actually named, people often ask me, what does Serge stand for? And I said, well, it's short for Sergio.
Ryan, I can't give you enough credit. I really appreciate the kindness for there. So
please just don't sue us. That's the big thing. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Sergio, for joining us today. This is this is our Coffee Talk with Serge interview series. Every other week, we're going to bring a fascinating person on to chat with. Hopefully talk about what they've done, what they're doing, all sorts of things like that. Sergio is a longtime friend of mine, several other, Mick Baccio as well. We go back pretty long time. The DC Cyber Tribe, as some of us call it, back in the day when we used to have real jobs, fighting the bad guys, doing the bits and the bytes. Although you still do quite a bit of that. Now you're educating the next generation. So for those who've never seen one of these coffee talks before, which is impossible because this is the first one we've ever done for an interview series, we're going to be about 30-45 minutes. We'll see where the spirit takes us, see where the conversation goes. We're going to talk some questions, talk to Sergio about what he's doing, and then we're going to finish off, and then we'll be back next week. So strap in. Sergio, for those who don't know who you are, both of them in the world, would you mind just telling folks a little bit about yourself, where you've been, what you're doing?
Oh man. So I've been all over the place, literally, physically all over the place, but also I think mentally all over the place. So I started as a professional theatrical lighting designer way back when.
And that's the obvious. I mean, that's where most of us started in cyber.
I agree, exactly.
I would like to stop here for a moment and say, as we were prepping for this call, Sergio stopped everything and said, hold on, I got to get my lighting right. And now this is all making sense.
I did. And so I got there, but then, this was back in the late 90s. And I was like, you know what, computers are probably going to be really important to our lives. And I was like, I really want to have some sort of input into what that's going to mean to everybody. So I went and got into computer science. I also have a degree in Christian theology, which is strange. So go ahead with all your Bible software jokes. But I've heard all of those before. So I have a really eclectic background in all kind of art and computer science and theology, kind of like a whole weird mix of things. And then, it kind of jumped into computer security. It became a thing.
Yeah, I heard it's seems to be doing well.
It is. It was not when I joined it. It was kind of like a dark horse, and it was kind of like, is this really what I want to do? And my advisor actually was like, nobody really makes a lot of money doing this. That's what I was told. That was my career advice starting out in my life. But it was fun, so I went with it. And then I was at NSA, the U.S. National Security Agency, for almost 9 years, and then hopped over to Microsoft, started their threat intelligence mission over there, then Dragos, and started their threat intelligence mission over there. And then I also, during the last 6 years, actually, we celebrated 6 years yesterday, was the 6-year founding of the Global Emancipation Network, where I've been supporting the mission to counter human trafficking online. And Splunk is honestly a huge supporter of that mission, by the way. So Splunk for Good and a whole bunch of folks over at Splunk for years have been just wonderful partners of ours working on that mission. So big shout out to all of the support there.
People don't realize this, but Sergio is the least charismatic, least interesting, and least smart person in his marriage. So
I am, and that is absolutely true. My wife eclipses me in all of those endeavors, and I married up. Absolutely, I love that.
That's our family motto, so I understand. It's always good to do so.
So now I left Dragos in October. I didn't make a big deal of it, but left Dragos in October to spend more time on the Global Emancipation Network and to spend more time teaching. So I've, I thought now is a good time for me to kind of try to foster more, a fundamental tradecraft shift, if you will, in threat intelligence and digital forensics, incident response. So now I spend most of my time teaching professionally, and then my quiet hours I spend doing human trafficking work. So.
And when you say hours, you mean both of them for the other 27 hours a day that
Exactly.
you work, is my understanding.
Yeah. Oh, I do. It is unfortunately one of the things that my passions sometimes drive me a little too warm, I should say. So
well, you've been pretty open about that. It's something
yeah.
You've spoken and you've tweeted about, you've written blogs on, the dangers of burnout in our society, of loving what you do sometimes a little bit too much, right?
Too much. I can't tell you enough, man. And I've been through burnout now 3 times in my career. I've had professional burnout. It's really hard, and I think that the challenge is that I have a wonderful support network around me, friends and family who are like, hey, you're not doing well, you need help, when I don't see it in myself. And part of this journey that I'm on right now with by teaching is part of my journey in mental health recovery, and I actually love that for me, right? And I'm happy to share and talk about that, and which is that sometimes life is not a straight path, and it's not the path you may have planned for yourself, but the thing is sometimes you have to recognize when you've got to take care of yourself, and you've got to take care of those around you, and you have to make that a priority. And that's kind of what I've done, and I've tried to take that approach and grow. And I like to say, my therapist tells me, therapy is not for fun, therapy is for work, because you're constantly working on yourself, and it really is. If you're improving yourself, it should feel like work. It's not the work you're used to in front of your computer, looking at packets or logs or whatever, but it's a different kind of work. But improving yourself should feel like work. You should be working on it. So I really, so it's something I'm very open about, and I love speaking about, because honestly, we don't, in this community, just like in most places, mental health is still a huge stigma that isn't treated appropriately, and it's really important for all of us.
Well, I remember, when I saw that you were moving into the full-time teaching, I was really happy for you, because I know that's one of your passions. And it was actually one of my favorite things about cybersecurity is you get to meet your heroes. And a lot of my heroes have been from reading IEEE white papers. And that's actually the first time that I was kind of introduced to your work, was being something that I think a lot of people know about, but may not know the provenance or the background. But, folks like yourself and Andy Pendergast, writing the Diamond model, which is the basis for a lot of people's threat intelligence work still to this day. For those who haven't read the white paper as much as they should have, and you have homework if you haven't, would you mind just kind of going over some of that and kind of what your thoughts are around it?
Yeah. So it requires a little history lesson, as some of these do. Back in 2004 and 2005, when I joined the National Security Agency, there were 2 of us doing this job, and I'm not even joking. It was myself and a dear friend of mine, Brian Schreiner, who unfortunately passed. And Brian was a 20-year signals intelligence analyst. He had worked with the Russia target for his entire career. You can imagine he's basically like Mick, right? But he listens to death metal all day. So he's kind of grizzled, and he's I
like that your direct was like, he's just like Mick except for death metal. He's very grizzled, full stop.
Yes. So like Mick, he's been there, he's kind of done that. He's got the scars, and he's just very, very wizened, I like to say. So I joined NSA, and they partnered me with this dude who'd been around forever, right? And he was pretty scary.
He didn't write the cuckoo's egg; he wrote the pterodactyl egg, because he's been around that long.
He was around way back when, right? And so anyway, I get sat next to this dude, and they're like, okay, you guys are going to work on the cyber threat thing. And it was 2 of us. And we, and there was only 2 of us. And then Andy joined us not too much later. They were like, oh, here, you can have a contractor, right? Not to obviously speak bad about contractors, but they're like, hey, you might need a little bit of, there's maybe more than 2 of you's worth of work in cyber threats. So how about you have a contractor? And so that's when Andy, and then at that point, it was also Maureen who joined us. And so we all had to kind of figure it out as we went. None of the tools we had were very useful. I was still decoding hex packets by hand. Like literally, like I would get hex dumps and I'd have to like pull out all the packets manually and decode the content. Like this is the line. This was line analysis at the time, right? And so then back in, and then Chris Betts joined us, and we were doing a whole bunch of stuff. And then it was 2000 and maybe 7 or 8, where all of a sudden the U.S. government was like, hey, this cyber thing looks like it's important. And how about we give you 200 more analysts? You 4 people know how to do this. Why don't you teach all of them how to do it? So all of a sudden I was like, what, you want us to teach 400 people how to do this, 200, 300 people how to do this work? They're like, yeah. And so that's where Chris and Andy and I sat down at a whiteboard and we were like, we just sketched out like, how do we even do our job? Like, we don't even know. Right. And that's where the diamond model came from. It came from, okay, how do we get to the basics so that we can explain to people, other people, like, what do you do? How do you do what you do? And it was literally just as they say, invention is the mother of necessity. And that's exactly what this was. It was, how do we train 200, 300 people to do this job? And we sketched out the diamond. And it became a DoD model for a long time. And that's how you got to know it and others. It was kind of shared very informally inside of DoD for a long time. And then after fighting with pre-publication review for a good year, we finally got it out the door in 2013. And, fundamentally, man, it is literally back to where we started. It's like, how do you do this job 101? What are the fundamental ideas that get you to that next idea? And I always tell people it's not about how to do your job. It's about teaching you the basics so that you can figure out how you do your job. Because I can tell you in my entire career of training thousands of analysts now, not a single person that I've ever seen does it the same. And I love that about this, right? The creativity in this field. But of course, then from a training and teaching perspective, that's not great. And so how do you get them from the basics to, okay, now how do you want to do analysis? And so it kind of gets you to that next step. It's like, here are the basics. Now you kind of take it from there. And then you have MITRE ATT&CK and you have, the kill chain you kind of layer on top of all of these. And it's wonderful. So I've been super proud. It's like a baby to me. I've just been proud to see, how much it's been helpful of other people.
Well, it's now past its 10-year anniversary, right? Almost 10 years since it was published externally. If you were to redo the diamond model, would you make it a tetrahedron model? Would
no.
you make it something else? Just keep it simple, stupid, just down to those 4 axes? And
that's a good question. I think that, people ask me, hey, Sergio, are you going to write a diamond model 2.0? And I always tell people no. I'm not going to do that. The reason is because I don't find anything compelling enough to revise the diamond model. There's a lot of good ideas out there, but I haven't found anything that I've latched onto that was like, oh, this really is the next iteration of it. And I leave that to probably others, right, who can probably take the idea differently. And I like, and back in your later in your later, we might talk about problems we've had in analysis in our career. And obviously one of those issues is anchoring bias. That as you get older, as you get wizened, if you will, or wiser, you will find yourself, it's harder and harder to come up with new ideas. And this is just the fact of being human. And I think the diamond model is like that for me, right? I am heavily anchored in it, and I think one of the good things I do have is I'm really good at looking internally and seeing myself and being like, I don't know if I could come up with the newest idea, but there's a lot of people who are, and I think that might be kind of a good opening for others to kind of take on. The one thing I would remove from the paper would be all of the math. And the reason I
didn't
added
even read it the first time, so So
I know, and it keeps people from reading it, and I'm frustrated by that. But I felt the math was absolutely necessary because at the time, cybersecurity was not taken seriously,
yep.
and I was like, this needs to have some formality around it so that it would be taken more seriously as no, that we can actually study this as you study other sciences.
Are you trying
Um,
to say that you didn't feel confident telling someone with a straight face that chittering panda and dancing Murphys with diametrically opposed fuzzy porn was not like, guys, this is a
yeah,
serious nation state threat.
it,
We need to,
I agree, man. But I think that I think that the issue is that uh, I also came from a tradition recognized of very traditional computer science and information security, right? And so I grew up in information security when everything was formal models, formal proving,
yeah.
levels of assurance, where you could provably secure something. And so I think that influenced me dramatically in, okay, well, to be taken seriously, we have to have some provable model or disprovable model that we can draw from. Um, and I feel that that's one thing, maybe that's one tradition maybe we've lost a bit in cybersecurity. I think the diamond model may have taken it a little too far. But I think one of the problems we have in cybersecurity is it's too much, there's too much lore, I would say, maybe. And there's not enough rigor or science in what we have been doing. And that's going to make it really hard for us to grow analysts into the next generation because we're too busy teaching people like how do you use this tool, or oh, there's this one trick, you got these if you only knew these 5 tricks you could be an amazing analyst, right? Kind of like clickbaity kind of stuff. And I think that until we kind of crack that nut and get away from kind of how I do it to how should we do it, I think we're going to be kind of stuck from
It's
growing a little
interesting. I
bit.
was on I'm on a Signal chat group with a couple other, team leads and senior analysts and research groups, and we were talking about attribution, right? Which is always a big question. And obviously, when you were at Microsoft, I think one of the things you guys did was kind of throw everything out and said like, hey, we're going to use these element names because our telemetry is different. And I know, Dragos, you had similar, and I had a more junior analyst who was complaining about this because she's like, why can't we just all agree that this is the bad guy and let's call that what it is. Like, this is APT5 and everyone should agree with that. And I was like, well, from my point of view, it's impossible for me to say that. Like, my telemetry is different than your telemetry. And I think this is something you've been, you've been the Paul on the road to Damascus a bit about, if I'll pull from your theology of proselytizing, because it's true. Like, we do not, except for the NSA, except for someone with FISA data, except for someone with humans, it is very difficult for me to say, didgeridoo panda is these 4 people in this office in Beijing, and everyone should know that everything left and right, left bound and right bound, are exactly the same. And I think, that's one of those big issues that's really confusing for people starting in this industry. Like, why is APT 29 not this?
And I think it's also challenging that as an analyst matures in this space, one of the things that most people will quickly realize is that it is like most things in the world, these aren't black and white issues. And as you get further, and this is something I've had to train a lot of analysts on, is that that think of intrusion sets like startup companies. That one day a startup like that you love dearly, that you name Zoom or whatever, right? That is Zoom to you, right? But then they get bought by Microsoft, and then they become Teams. So are they Zoom or are they Teams now? And then Microsoft spins them out, and they become a whole different company, right? Maybe they get sold to Honeywell or something like that.
And by the way, they've created their own startup now in their garage after hours.
Exactly. Yeah, and some of the people, engineers, exactly, who were working on that group, right, on that product, have now gone on to start up their own new thing, right? So are you tracking it by people? Because if you are, that's really amorphous, actually. Are you tracking it by ownership? That becomes even more challenging as things move around. Are you tracking it by tool set? That obviously changes. And so as you kind of grow in your career, and you kind of get deeper and deeper into how the offensive side of this world really works, you will recognize very quickly that these are more complicated than you would ever imagine. And I continuously learn about new offensive operating models, where I'm like, oh yeah, I guess they could do that. I didn't think they would, but that's a different way of doing it. And that's why this idea of what's a group, what's a name, to me is very much it's kind of up to you. And that's why in English we can have a name for something, and in French we can have a name for something, and we can be okay with that. And we can recognize that, yeah, and we may not, even across cultures, we may not use that. We may use that word for other things that are not the same as we use them together, right? And so I think we have to recognize that we live in a world where humans exist, and this is important. Is you cannot make you can't turn this into some sort of machine idea. It's humans are all through this. They're attackers, they're victims, and all this stuff.
Well, that kind of leads into one of my other questions I had for you, which is around, from your perspective, from your telemetry of teaching thousands of students, from working at multiple, both giant companies, startups, and, the NSA. What do you think are, perhaps some of the biggest misconceptions that you see in cybersecurity today from your perspective, that people either accept as gospel or that, perhaps have started moving in, but aren't really as accurate as you might think?
One of the things that frustrates me with trying to break students of concepts is that we do too much job training. And what I mean is, yes, you have to be able to do a job. That's just how we all get paid, how we eat, how we live. So please don't think of it that way. What I mean is that we lose the sense of fundamental. And I think one of the things that I've had to really retrain people on is to get yourself out of how you've been trained to do something and start thinking about how you would want to do something. And that's really, to me, one of the most important things. I got to get people out of, break their anchoring bias, which is, it's not about the tool, it's actually about the mental process.
Right.
And you can use lots of tools to do it. Remember when we had more than just...
I'm going to have to stop you there. Actually, the only tool you can use is Splunk, but continue. No, it's fine.
I absolutely love you. But, it's like, you remember when we had more than Wireshark as a packet processing tool? Like those are kind of the same ideas, right? So to me, that's something that's really critical that isn't being taught. I think people are being taught tools to get the job done today, but really ignoring that students need a more fundamental understanding of why they're doing what they're doing. And we don't give people enough time to do that. And this is one of the problems is, I think in our current education model, most students are, I'm in a class for a day, I'm getting a certification. Oh, I've got a 40-hour boot camp. That is not enough time, right, for a student to understand why they are doing something. What that just means is you're gonna have to spend more money retraining that person later. And I think that is a fundamental issue we have in growing the field, and something that a lot of students in cybersecurity don't recognize is that they aren't being given those tools. They're not being taught really fundamentally why they're doing what they do, or necessarily alternatives to how they do it, because they're too busy trying to get to the answer as quickly as possible.
Or to synthesize that, because I've talked about this where people ask me like, oh, how can I get into cyber? And I see some questions coming in from people who are new in that. And actually, Mick Baccio right now is at a New to Cyber Summit for SANS, which is a great event if you can attend or see some of the stuff online. And I point out, listen, I've been doing cyber/IT since 1999. So 20 plus years, 23 years. Mm-hmm. I would say of the 23 years, probably 5 years of it is still relevant in terms of tactical knowledge. Now I have more wisdom. I have more background info. But when I talk to my wife, she's a medieval Spanish art historian. She's a doctorate in, what she does for a field. She's a museum director.
Yeah, your wife is flipping brilliant, by the way. I love talking to her, so it's awesome. So
but everything she does, it's like from her undergraduate to the last conference she presented at, that's still building on her corpus of knowledge. But so much of our work is tactical, right? 15 years ago, I could boot up Wireshark. I knew every single plugin. I knew how to rip through the packets. Now that doesn't matter. If you have you want to talk about Novell, I got you. BNC taps, wonderful. Let me tell you, Exchange 5.5, I can scrub that prib.edb, but In a world of AWS, where every time I log on, there's a new chiclet, that threat model is completely changed. So to me, the strategic aspect of why, not how, becomes a very important base that's going to help your career, rather than just focusing on, how many people do you know that had a CCNA, right? And for those who don't have nearly as much gray as Sergio and I do, that was a Novell NetWare certification. And when that software went bust, there were tens of thousands of people whose entire career focus had changed, right? And if you don't have the basis of the cybersecurity or the computer science, if you have that base, it doesn't matter what the tool is. You're able to do the job, which I think is perhaps the most important thing, which kind of pivots into the next question I had. For those who are new to cyber or new to threat intelligence, if you were to kind of go through and say, listen, I'm on my way to get a coffee, I only have a couple minutes, boom, here's my nugget of knowledge, what would you give them? What pamphlet would you give?
I think that the answer to that is don't start attacking threats until you can defend your own network. It's the first thing I tell people. You need operational experience. And the reason is exactly as I explained before. The world of offensive cyber is extremely complex. And one of the reasons it's complex is because the complexity of how people defend their environment. And without having knowledge of both sides of that coin, it becomes very challenging for anybody who wants to study threats without understanding that the two components of threats are the offensive side and the defensive side. These two things obviously work together, right, in a sort of synergistic way. So that's what I tell people, is that most people I talk to are like, hey, I'm going to go get a pen testing certification. I'm going to go do, these 3 tool certifications. And I should be good, right? And I'm like, no, you have no idea about how to defend anything, which is why I tell most people when they get started, go work in the SOC. Literally, like, go get SOC experience. And I think, somebody in here in the chat just said, a good offense is a good defense. That might work in soccer, but it doesn't work in cybersecurity.
I'm sorry,
right?
did you not read the Biden-Harris cybersecurity strategy? We're hacking back now. That's the new thing.
And I love that approach,
baby.
Yeah, and I love it. I love that we're, we need to think more and differently. And I'm not trying to, please don't get me, don't take this as like get off my lawn kind of ridiculousness. But the fact is that it's much more complicated than that, right? Than it is. This is not a sports game, right? Yeah. Kind of thing. Real people are at stake, right? Real things are happening. Real people are doing real bad stuff. And so you've got to think a little bit more creatively and comprehensively about the problem. And so that's where I tell most people, which is, if you want to be a good threat intel analyst, you've got to be a good network defender. That's where you got to start, because it's only then that you understand the scope of the problem that you're working on. And also, you're going to get the scope of the creativity of the adversaries. Because remember, an adversary can never do what a defender didn't allow them to do. If a defender didn't enable IP packets on their network, the offensive side can't use IP-enabled attacks against the defender, right? So, and this is something I taught Microsoft, right? Which is, you own the physics of the problem. The adversary can't do anything you don't allow them to do. Now, I'm not saying like, oh, you got to shut your networks down. You still got to be operational, but fundamentally, you own the problem, and your decisions are what are driving the attackers to make the choices they are. So, and that's the other thing, is I think most defenders don't understand how much power they really have. They feel like they're powerless. And some of that is driven by they're powerless by policy, or powerless by investment, right? They're not getting the resources they need and things of that nature. But recognize that I think most defenders, they get stuck in the mindset of, oh, I don't have enough money, I can't do it. Or, oh, the policy doesn't allow me. Or the business is just stuck, they'll never do it. And I don't think most defenders think creatively enough around, okay, well, how could we do this while having that constraint in place, right? Lots of businesses and startups are created in sectors that everyone thought there's no way that anything could be done here. And yet people figure out ways that could be done. So I think a lot of people discount their own creativity and opportunity that exists in doing smart things in a smart way.
I find that to be one of the most absolute truths, is how much you can do with how little. And some of it's just policy and procedure. Some of it's just ridiculously simple. Like, I hate to say it. Have you patched? Do you have MFA? Have you reduced admin access? Can you see those things? Like, those are stupid. Like, one thing I always push, I hate when people say like, oh, the defense has to get it right every time, the offense only has to get it right once. And I'm like, I've done the red teamy side. And when you're actually attacking a well-patched, basic cybersecurity, as Mick would say, who've eaten their cyber veggies, it's really hard. You have to get really innovative to get,
Yep.
like, you might get a foothold. Oh crap, now I can't go through. Like, oh, it's a fully patched Windows 2018 server with a firewall turned on. Okay, I popped this box, but now I'm in this little jail and I can't move laterally. Well, I just spent
Yep.
15 hours doing this one thing to no
Yep.
avail. What do I do now? Like,
I love that, Ryan, because you're right. It's a challenge, and this is what the diamond and both the kill chain teach us, right? Is that there are multiple things in play. It's the adversary isn't using one thing. There's capabilities, there's technologies, there's a whole bunch of stuff. And if you look at the kill chain of a process-based approach, you'll recognize that, okay, you're not always going to stop the email coming in, but could you stop the installation of that? Could you stop maybe you cannot create a strong enough email filtering program. Guess what? Welcome to the real world. That exists for all of us, right? We all wish we could filter email better, right? But maybe you can't. So maybe the next thing you got to do is, now how do I get installation control of my hosts so I can prevent unknown executables or scripts from installing? And then even from that, it's like, okay, let's say we do that. Then how could I stop unknown applications from communicating outbound from the network, right? So maybe you can't stop the installation. Maybe you go another step into the kill chain. And if people started thinking of this as a full scope kind of operation, they would recognize that the corollary to the defender's paradox is true, right? Which is that that the defender has to be right at every time. My answer is absolutely not.
Nope.
The defender only has to be right once. You just have to stop the adversary at one point in their chain to generally be successful at what you do. And likewise, as you said, the offensive side has to be able to execute every single one of their steps. So we don't give defenders nearly enough credit as to the power that they actually have to controlling as I say, the physics of the problem.
Yeah, and this goes back. I mean, this is, once again, DoD roots. So for me, it's about controlling your battle space. If you know where the battle takes place, which the nice thing about cybersecurity is you inherently do. We're going to avoid M&As, put them over to the side. But I mean, you have control of what you can do. Now, to your point, there might be politics between. Now, when I've gone through this, once again, I started as a Unix plumber, as an Exchange 5.5 repair, and I grew up in a world of demarcation points. So for me, cybersecurity is I need to get a network telemetry sensor. I need Zeek, or I need something showing inbound and outbound. I'm going to have this, I'm going to have that. And when the cloud came around, like, I looked into it, I'm like, oh, it's just someone else's data center. I get this. And then I went talked to a customer, and they like, Kovar, I need some help. We're trying to defend. We have these Lambda functions that kick off these ephemeral services. We do 280,000 of these services every 30 minutes, and then they disappear, and we're concerned an adversary might get in. And I was like, oh shit, I actually don't know what the cloud is now. Like, I had a moment where I was like, oh, technology moved faster than my defensive perspective. And I had to spend basically a year re-educating myself on where the world of network defense has gone. Have you seen anything for yourself as our world has changed, as you've also kind of retreated back to let's teach the basics, but are the things that you've found have just fundamentally changed your perspective of a network defender or a threat intelligence world?
I think that it would be silly to think that none of us have had any significant surprises in our career, right? I that's what I always tell people is never talk badly about the adversary. Never call your adversary stupid. Never think that they are below you or somehow
you don't think it's a good idea to taunt a nation state?
No. Oh God, please don't do that. They'll own you just because they can at that point. But
I can't imagine anyone ever doing that.
We've never seen that before. So I think the first thing is you have to have some sort of respect for your opponent. Just like in any kind of martial art, if you will, think of it in those terms. The issue I think would come down to is that, can you be surprised in a controlled way? And this is something we learn in intelligence, because as we study the history of intelligence failures, which almost are never actually intelligence, they're almost always policy failures, almost never intelligence failures, that the challenge becomes, could we know something that we didn't, even in an environment we don't fully control? And the answer is that from thousands of years of intelligence, we know that it's, yeah, the battle domain moves, things change, technology changes, but the fundamentals are still the fundamentals. There's capabilities, there's infrastructure, there's adversaries, and there's victims. Getting back to the diamond model, that no matter what changes, no matter whether it's a cloud or no matter whether it's quantum computing or whatever, those things will always exist. Which I think should give us as defenders a warm and fuzzy to be like, yeah, you know what? It's technology changes too fast, faster than any of us can really kind of appreciate. But it doesn't change. It doesn't change actually very fundamentally. Like the cloud isn't a fundamental shift. It's not. We've had distributed computing for 40 odd years.
It's cyclical, right? Like we go from thick to thin, back and forth.
Exactly. And we were maintaining and securing distributed computing systems and mainframes back in the 70s. People may not realize that, that this was something we used to do, was to control remote computers and mainframes.
You mean something like ARPANET?
Yes, exactly. And so the fact is that if you look at it in terms of, again, they say if you don't understand history, you're doomed to repeat it, then yes, you will forget that really everything is just an iteration on a model we've already seen, which is one of the things is that I teach my students a lot of old attacks, because they're a lot easier to understand than the new attacks, because then you have like new technology and stuff you gotta wrap your head around. But the fundamentals are completely the same. So I would say for most people, don't let yourself become, don't let technology scare you to the point that you think this stuff is super like different. It's not. You might have to learn a new domain or a new like bit of technology to understand how this works. But fundamentally, it's going to be the same types of attack, just in a different.
So it's almost like, once again, build up your corpus of knowledge around the domain and don't worry as much about the tactical.
Weird. Yep. The tactical will come. You're just going to pick it up over your 20 or 30 years that you do this. I guarantee it. But something you're going to learn is an attack that you saw 10 years ago, you're going to see again 10 years from now, just maybe in a different place. So.
The best example of this, of course, which Sergio is alluding to, I assume, is The Cuckoo's Egg, which a wonderful book written in 1987 about Cliff Stoll's adventure of fighting East German hackers in a cloud network. For all intents and purposes, he's doing PCAP analysis, he's doing IP reversing. If you've never seen it, if you've never read it, please do. I know Chris Sanders, a good friend of ours as well. And I'll post some links after this is all done.
But please go take Chris's course on it. It's great. I love it.
And it's free. And it's wonderful. The book is great. And it's 100% applicable for today's cybersecurity world. And that's always a fun one because, it started off with him just losing money and never letting go of a problem. Right. And he had some failures along the way, which is actually something I wanted to talk to you about. We like to end this interview series. Our team motto, when Marcus and I were at DARPA, we had a saying of fail less. And it wasn't a negative thing. It was just that the concept is, as a network defender, I always assumed compromise. We always assumed we could do better. I never had a single breach or single compromise where I didn't find something that would have let me know that it happened. There was always a snort signature. There was always a Yara signature we could have written. There was an unpatched box that we knew about, but we had a POAM, where we had a plan to patch it in a month, but we didn't get to it. There was always something. So our motto was fail less. I personally have a story of when I was a young enlisted sailor, accidentally, rerouting 30 ships worth of internet traffic through a microwave relay that I forgot to turn off and causing some damage to the Fifth Fleet. Long story, but we would love to know, Sergio, just between you, me, and a couple 100,000 people watching, what is your biggest failure in your career that you learned from and you were like, yep, I screwed up and this is how I overcame it?
So, okay. So I think that back in 2009, while I was with the government, one of the things we were being challenged with was realizing this is like Pandora's box. Okay, imagine you have 10 years worth of adversaries that have been playing around with basically nobody watching them, and all of a sudden you kind of crack open the box, and it's like it's filled with cockroaches who are all trying to scurry, right? That's what it was like in DoD back in 2007, 8, 9, up to 10 probably. We cracked open this Pandora's box, and all of a sudden there was a lot in here, right, that we'd never really recognized before. I was one of the government's lead cyber analysts at the time, for good and for ill, and I made a decision that I talked leadership into, that we needed to that there were so many adversaries, there were so many ways that adversaries were operating. We were hampering ourselves by trying to put everything into a box, basically by naming every adversary or trying to put all of this together. It was just too much for us to do. And so I promulgated a decision through DoD and a lot of U.S. government that we weren't going to use names anymore. That we were going to get away from that, and we were just going to look at the activity as it came. Right, exactly. And you all can blame the heck out of me because I own up to these decisions. Right, I made this decision, and one thing I didn't learn is there's two things I forgot when I made that decision of, hey, you know what, all of us as analysts, and even I tried to talk the international community into doing this, right? And that it partially worked. And I'm glad that most people were smarter than me and just didn't listen. And I really appreciate that. And the issue is that I forgot two things in my career, or at that point. One was humans love names. We love to put a name to something because it gives us ownership and it makes us feel like we are in control. And without that, we feel obviously very out of control and unable to really cognitively appreciate our world. And that was, I think, a fundamental human behavior that I completely misjudged at the time. The second fact is that names actually matter for analysis, not just for humans, but they matter because over time you have to be able to associate things with other things. And one of the ways you do that is through labels, through naming things, like you could name any rat, and you'd be like, all of a sudden an analyst would brains explode when you name a rat because they think of all the things associated with that rat. Like if I said, hey, Ryan, you remember poison ivy, right? All of a sudden, all of these neurons start firing, right, with all of these associations with that word. And so what I recognized kind of early-ish in my career, luckily, and this is actually something that took me later very, very importantly, was that language is equally as powerful as technology knowledge. And it's something that I started learning again back in about 2009, that it wasn't just the understanding of the threats and the technology and the malware and all of this that was important, but it was having a really good ability to communicate what those were, why they mattered, because fundamentally that's actually our knowledge transfer. It's not sticks, it's not taxi, it's not miter attack, it's not diamond. We use a plethora of language, English and other languages, to describe things that we communicate with analysts, which is one of the challenges with information sharing, is that we treat information sharing like it should be some sort of JSON stuck in a Word or PDF document, when information is, as we know from human communication, much, much, much more complicated than that. And our understanding cannot just be dropped onto a page, just as if you read a novel, the only thing going through your head are the words on the page. No, you're imagining a whole other world just with a few words. So I think what we've forgotten, I think, in technology is that we've removed too much of the human element of what we're trying to solve, and the power and importance of communication and the complexity of it is equally as important as our understanding of the technology underneath it. And so that's a big mistake that I'm glad that fortunately did not do too much damage. But it's one that I look back in my career as, man, if I could go back and slap myself in the head and be like, don't you dare do that.
Don't waste time there. Yeah.
That would be the one. So.
There we go. Now, I see some people asking some questions. What is the name, Chris's last name? Sanders, Saunders. I will post links to everything afterwards once we get through. So please, we had some people asking for recordings. It's on LinkedIn and also YouTube, so you can watch this again later. And Sergio, I promise a softball question. You are an incredibly busy man, but is there anything specifically you'd love for people to look into for what you're doing, what you're working on right now? Anything that you think people should be keeping their eye on?
Yeah, I think that one thing I would love people to do is to take time away from your day for yourself. Your work is not who you are. Don't define yourself by what you do and what you know. None of us make it out of this alive. And so recognize, more importantly, all of the components that your life makes up, which includes yourself and your friends and your family and others, your pets and others around you, your environment that you live in. And if there's one message that's very, very important to me, it's that information security, threat intelligence, and cybersecurity is all consuming. And we are our own problem. We do this to ourselves, and we expect everybody to be like, oh, you need to go read these 10 books, or oh, if you're not listening to these 5 podcasts, what are you even doing? And we're, we got to follow 10 different Twitter, hashtags or whatever. You know what? My answer to you is don't. Learn what you need to learn, enjoy what you're doing, but don't make it everything that you are. I guarantee you will be better and you will last longer and have a more illustrious career if you don't worry so much about the now and you worry more about what you are, right? And who you are. Because man, I have counseled way too many people in this career field around burnout that I feel like it is probably our number one actual issue when it comes to retention.
I don't know, Sergio. I'm pretty sure if I synthesize what you just said, was cybersecurity kills 100% of all analysts over time.
Oh Jesus! Did I just say that? Oh my God! I think I did.
Yeah, it's.
Oh God! Oh, I just learned
career.
Something.
Take that, Alaska.
Okay, so don't do cybersecurity. You're gonna die. Okay, this is what we've all just learned now, and that's wow. That is insight. So I would just say, I'm not gonna leave you with something to read or something to do or something to watch. I'm going to leave you with a question of, are you doing enough for yourself? And are you going to be happy with what you're doing for yourself?
So. Which is good life advice for everyone and anyone, right? So that's wonderful. Thank you, Sergio. Ali, I know I had a lot of questions by people wanting to know where they can find more information, not about burnout, although we should throw something on there now. Would you mind throwing up the slide for what we have coming up next for those who do wish to follow podcasts and other events? Kirsty Payne, who's a beloved friend of the show, she'll be at Cyber UK in Belfast. And then my wonderful team will be heavily at RSA. Audra Streetman and Lillian Teng will be presenting on just how people got into the careers they did from 2 very different perspectives. David Bianco, author of Pyramid of Pain and one of the most wonderful humans in the world, is going to be talking about his analysis of 5 billion certificates and the trustworthiness of CAs. And finally, Dr. Fetterman, who recently joined the team from MITRE and CISA, is going to be talking about how to do threat-informed planning with attack trending. And then the very next slide, for those who are curious, we are here every Tuesday. So come join us every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 1300 Central, and 1400 East Coast in America, because I'm very US biased for my time zones. I just have to remember those. And you can find us on YouTube. You can find us all sorts of other places. Sergio, thank you so much for kicking out this series. I can't imagine anyone better. I always learn something every time I chat with you. So absolutely.
I love you, Ryan. Yeah. Thank you all so much. And Audra and Mick, you all just keep killing it. You're doing a great job. I really appreciate being here. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. And Ollie, feel free to close us out. Thanks, y'all.